Next half an hour, we'll see what's making headlines with the broadcaster and author Natasha Devon and the Executive Director of the Youth Endowment Fund, John Yates. Guys, thanks very much for being with us. Let's take a look at what is on some of those front pages, and we'll start with the Daily Telegraph, which reports that the Prime Minister is under pressure to allow Storm Shadow missiles to be used to strike deep inside Russia. The Times leads with big payouts for workers contracted out of hours as the Labour government looks at introducing new policy to allow workers to switch off from work at home. Well, the Eye leads with an investigation which found almost 3,000 children and teenagers are believed to have been spiked with dangerous drugs in the last 3 years. The Metro leads with the government's plans to treat extreme misogyny as a form of extremism with the headline War on Women Haters. The Financial Times reports a senior US banker thinks the Federal Reserve needs to take a gradual approach to lowering borrowing costs as confidence grows that inflation is under control there. The Mirror has an exclusive story on a mother of two who died after having cosmetic surgery in Turkey, which she hoped would change her life. And more than half of Keir Starmer's MPs took union cash to help them fight the election, so says the Daily Mail. And the Daily Star has a story about aliens. And a reminder, by scanning the QR code you see on screen during the programme, you can check out the front page of tomorrow's papers while you watch along with us. All right, we're joined tonight by Natasha Devon and John Yates. As I said, Natasha, John, thanks very much for being with us. Let's get straight on and look at the front page of The Guardian. John, Blinken joins 11th hour talks on Gaza ceasefire deal. And I've lost count of the amount of times Anthony Blinken's been in the region to try and resolve this. Yeah,
and I've lost count of the number of hours. I mean, it doesn't feel like the 11th hour, does it? It feels like the 111th hour. So this is the 10th visit, apparently, of Anthony Blinken, the US Secretary of State. I think you could have missed a lot of them because not much has really moved since that terrible attack almost a year ago now, on October the 7th. But there is a sense of possibility. This visit is including meetings with the Israeli Prime Minister and bringing together of regional leaders. And there's a sense of maybe there might be some agreement, some sort of ceasefire agreement. I think part of the reason for hope, I think the main regional powers, whether the Saudis or the Iranians or to some extent you could say the Americans are a regional power in the Middle East, really do want peace. And part of that is political. The Iranian leaders really don't necessarily have the support of their public to continue some sort of regional war. And Biden would really like this sorted by the time of the election. I think the two problems you've got is Hamas and Israel. Netanyahu coming out pretty quickly saying, I'm up for a deal as long as I give absolutely nothing away. Hamas had to appoint, obviously, a new leader because Israel recently killed their leader, and they appointed the man who's in charge of the attacks in Gaza. I find it quite hard to be hopeful, but sometimes we get surprised. I much prefer to have the US Secretary of State in the Middle East than anywhere else trying to solve this problem. Yeah. So we all hold our breath.
But as you point out, the two belligerents are the ones who are most resistant to sorting this out, seemingly. And over the past couple of days, we've had both sides, Hamas and Israel, accusing the other of trying to stymie whatever deal may be coming.
I mean, from Hamas's point of view, this looks like a deal that has been brokered between the Israelis and America. And their feeling, according to reports, is that they're very much not around the table and haven't been included, which doesn't bode well. However, from the Israeli point of view, of Israeli citizens, they're desperately trying to get the remaining hostages back. And I saw a poll recently which showed that the majority of Israeli citizens no longer think that that is Netanyahu's priority. And the accusation is that he's deliberately extending this conflict because as soon as it comes to an end, the chances are he's going to be ousted as prime minister and will have to face the consequences of what's happened in Gaza. So as much as it is incredibly important that America make it look as if we're on the brink of a ceasefire right now for all the reasons that have already been stated, it's a tricky situation, to say the least. That's a massive understatement. Yeah,
and we saw huge protests yet again in Tel Aviv yesterday, demanding that the ceasefire is announced and the hostages come home.
Yeah, absolutely right. And I think this is the Netanyahu being so opposed to a deal because it might cause him to end up in prison means that the logical way to go is potentially to promise him a lot, get a temporary agreement in place and get Netanyahu out. And then maybe at least you've got one side that's led by a government that's actually really keen on trying to find a deal. That may be what they're trying to do, but it's obviously incredibly difficult and incredibly delicate to try and piece it together.
Yeah.
But the worst thing is we've obviously had attacks going on constantly between Hezbollah in Lebanon with Israel. The worst thing would be if this thing starts to spread. It's hard to imagine how it could get worse. It could get worse.
Yeah, it seems that the threat from both Hezbollah and Iran is that unless a deal is struck, there will be some kind of retaliation to those assassinations you mentioned. And let's not, of course, forget, over 40,000 people have now been killed in Gaza as this war keeps ticking on.
And probably more, because that doesn't take into account the number of people who are under the rubble and therefore their bodies haven't been counted.
Yeah.
All right, let's move on to the front of the Times if we can, guys. And I said contracted, but it says contacted is the headline. That's the right way to describe this, which is... it changes the story slightly, doesn't it, John? Talk us through this one.
Yeah, so this is a slightly odd story. I mean, the story basically says, you know, the headline is big payout for workers contacted out of hours. So basically the idea is I get rang by my boss at, I don't know, when am I logging off, 5 p.m? I get a phone call.
How nice.
Yeah, it's lovely. I get a phone call at 1 minute past 5 and I can claim my big payout. This is the new Labour approach to looking after workers. I love it. Obviously, that's not what's going to happen, right? So there's this huge sort of... I think the Times is trying to create a sort of boogeyman here to say that Labour's going to make it impossible for you ever to talk to your workers and that they're going to charge companies and it's going to be a total sort of... I mean, some workers may love the sound of all of this. But it's not actually what's being promised. What's actually being promised is incredibly minor. It's saying if I'm really ill-treated as a worker such that I take my employer to court for something else, at the moment I could get a little bit of extra money if I'm not treated well more generally. And being contacted out of hours could be included in me getting a little bit extra if there was the... So I just don't think... it's not really a very sort of significant thing. I think what's more interesting is Labour have a bit of a genuine dilemma in that they went into the election making quite big promises, slightly vague ones, about workers' rights. They're going to do something to give us workers more rights. And yet they also made promises to private industry that this is a government of private business and we're going to work to do everything we can to be pro-growth. Now, some people say there's no contradiction there, but there's definitely some tensions. And it seems in this case they've sort of gone very, very quiet on what the actual promise is for being contacted out of work.
But by the same token, you know, one of the biggest challenges that Rachel Reeves is facing as the new Chancellor is that I think it's 9.2 million people who are economically inactive, neither in a job nor looking for one actively. And making a job a more attractive prospect by giving workers more rights is one of the ways that we can encourage people into work.
Yeah, there's a debate to be had.
Yes.
But clearly what was generally, some people thought was going to happen was no more emails ever again after I log off, or I'll get millions of pounds. That's not what's going to happen.
Just looking forward to that. All right, let's move on to the front of the Mail. And, I mean, this has been... it's been a rumbling story for the past few days, and it's part of the headache that's being created for Labour. Yeah,
so... party founded by trade unions gets money from trade unions. It's one version of this story. Like, the story is half of Labour MPs, it says in pay of unions. I mean, they receive donations from unions. I think if we are surprised that Labour Party MPs receive donations from trade unions, I think we do need to sort of slightly mug up on the basics of British politics. But, and the amount of money here is not massive, right? They've made it like a collective sum of 1.8 million. That's because there's so many blinking Labour MPs now. I mean, it's about £90,000 per MP, which it sounds like, you know, a bit if it was given to me. It's not a massive amount of money. I think there is a story here, though, which is how much are Labour potentially being pushed around by the unions? And will be concerns, I think, within the government that they've tried to settle a lot of disputes with the unions. They've agreed some pay that they will say is absolutely right and proper, and they seem to be rewarded by more promises of strikes. And I think normal people will say, well, we're up for a bit more pay for people, but we kind of want the strikes to end. And are we actually on a racket where there's just more and more strikes and more pay? So I think there is a little bit of worry starting to grow.
Well, that has been the thrust of this paper and the Express in the past couple of days, that Labour are in hot to the unions. And I guess this is the next step of them making that argument.
But I know who the unions ultimately work for, and that is ordinary people, it's workers, famously. I'm far more concerned about donations that are given to political parties by anonymous businessmen or, you know, people who make racist comments about Diane Abbott. That, to me, is of far more note than, as you say, a party which has, for its since its inception, throughout the entirety of its existence, been in lockstep with unions. We know this about the Labour Party.
But does that make it difficult for them, as John's point was making, to have these settlements and have settlements with certain industries and then have more and more, potentially more strikes coming?
Well, at least the Labour Party are around the table, which the previous government were not. I appreciate that people have concerns about another round of strikes, but it's not a never-ending give them an inch, they'll take a mile. You know, there are a finite set of demands which are being asked for by people like the RMT union. It really just doesn't concern me that much.
Okay. I think the danger of, you know, some of us will see, is there can be a slight tendency of those of us who are sympathetic to Labour, that people fall into the trap of thinking people who run trade unions, their primary goal is what's best for the country. That shouldn't be their primary goal. If I am a member of a trade union, their primary goal should be me. And that's right, and that's their duty. And so there must be some tension between a government that's there for all the people who are elected and my union that's there for me as a worker. And so if the government are too close to unions, I think we're right to be a bit concerned. And so there's a bit to this story, but maybe not quite as much as they've made of it.
All right, let's move on to the front of the Financial Times now, talking about people being paid. And this concerns, she was Home Secretary for a spell, wasn't she? And was going to run for the leadership of the Conservative Party, Suella Braverman. Could you just take us through some of this reporting, Natasha?
Well, Suella Braverman has earned nearly £60,000 since leaving office late last year by making speeches across the world. And that's not even that much compared to what Liz Truss has made, which is £250,000 in the year after she was forced to stand down. £80,000 for a single speech that she gave in Taiwan, according to this report. There seems to be this kind of self-funding right-wing speaking circuit, which after people who have had high-profile positions within Conservative governments leave, they can get onto it and make enormous amounts of money. My question is, who is paying the woman who lost to a lettuce and crashed the economy for her thoughts in a public forum? £80,000.
Someone in Taipei.
Yeah. I mean, the best thing about this story, the strikeout thing, is someone paid Suella Braverman £12,000 for a 5-hour talk. I mean, I think she's an all right speaker, but 5 hours.
I wonder if there was lunch. I read that. I wonder if there was lunch involved and maybe tea breaks.
Maybe
and stuff.
Breakfast and dinner. I mean, it's absolutely extraordinary. I mean, again, there is something slightly more serious to this, which I do think, like, countries are different, right? And we should work out our own problems for our own country. And there is this slight flow of, like, US thinking into British thinking. All the time. And I don't think it's necessarily good. Like, I don't think we should come with our policies based on what we've seen in the West Wing or what happens to be going on Democratic and Republican. This is a different country. And so these networks, I think, are slightly worrying, whether you're on the right or on the left. We should be working out our own little ways of solving our problems, not trying to do what might make money on speeches in the United States.
Yeah, the speaker circuit is definitely one to discuss at another time. Right, Natasha, John, for now, thank you very much for that. But stay with us, because we've got plenty more from the front pages, including this, the main story for the Metro, their headline, War on Women Hates, as the Home Secretary unveils new plans to deal with extremism.
It's 24 peaks in 24 hours. Due to my visual impairment, Jack will be leading me all the way. We're training 5 or 6 times a week, lots of gym sessions. Communication is going to be the hardest and most intrinsic aspect to this challenge. So Jack and I work extremely closely together, and we're doing lots of exercises.
In September, it'll be the end of my first year as chairman of Seeability. It's also the charity's 225th year anniversary. So I wanted to do something really big challenge to raise awareness, but most importantly, raise as much money as possible. And I think we've seen lots of personal challenges that people do. I wanted to do something that would more align closely with the values of the charity. So challenging society's expectations of what they think is possible, but also even people's own expectations of what they can do. So I thought I would do something where I could support someone do something that they really wanted to do, rather than just me on my own. So I asked Michael if he was interested. Michael's also a trustee of the charity, and we worked together separately. And I gave him a list of options, list of ideas of things that we could do. Michael went straight to the bottom of the list, picked the one marked extreme, and here we are.
I became very aware of the fact that Seeability assists Jack's family to this day with Jack's brother. and charities like Seeability were so instrumental in my recovery post-sight loss. So it was really important to me, and I thought it would be fantastic to do it together. Happened at the age of 19, out the blue. I was studying for a medical degree at Barts and the London Medical School, and it became very apparent very quickly that I wouldn't be able to continue. So it was a huge, huge change to my life. So technology is a great enabler now, though. It's an amazing time from the technological developments on a day-to-day basis that allow me to operate very independently. And I think that's the real ethos of the charity: ambitious fulfilment constantly. So people who have really sort of devastating things that happen to them initially can really recover through sport and employment.
I'm lucky enough with my colleagues at work to see Michael day in, day out, navigating a fully sighted world in such an extremely good way. This is hopefully bringing a bit more attention to what other people might be able to achieve.
Hello there and welcome back. You're watching the press preview. Our guests, Natasha, Devon and John Yates. Guys, thanks for staying with us. Let's get to the front of the Metro if we can now, Natasha. And this, the headline there, War on Women Haters, a picture of the Home Secretary. Talk us through this reporting and what the plan is here.
So Yvette Cooper is essentially going to ensure that schools get guidance so that if they have pupils who fall under the spell of influencers like Andrew Tate and are expressing extreme misogynistic views, they can be referred to Prevent for de-radicalisation. And what's interesting about this is, at the moment, if a pupil is either expressing far-right views or Islamist terrorist-style views, they can currently be referred to Prevent. And misogyny is part of both of those ideologies. And yet, heretofore, misogyny hasn't been specifically focused upon in the Prevent framework. It's been more to do with things like racism and homophobia. But because of the fact that, for example, 98% of 18 to 25-year-old women have reported being sexually harassed or assaulted, and because we have, I think it was 1 in 4 young men saying that feminism is a problem and that they feel it's harder to be a man than to be a woman these days, the government has recognised that this is a huge issue amongst young people and that it needs some kind of targeted, specific support for schools to be able to address this.
Yeah, John, I guess, as Natasha mentions, the schools and its teachers who are going to have to be trying to identify this, which strikes me as quite a challenging extra burden for teachers to have to deal with.
Yeah, I think we've got to always be careful of throwing more things at schools. Teachers seem to be the solutions to all problems. But I think most schools would say they are already they feel that they're already having to do this. So most schools are now required to provide relationships and sex education, which isn't the same thing. But in that context, most teachers will say, we are worried about the boys and we are worried about what's going on with the girls. The Youth Endowment Fund, my day job, we did a survey of teenage girls really recently. 1 in 14 teenage girls said they'd experienced sexual assault in the last year. That includes unwanted touching. 1 in 14. So there's a real massive problem here. I'm not totally convinced Prevent is... I'm not opposed to us using Prevent to solve this problem, but it's not necessarily the only thing we should be doing. That what really has been shown to really work here is getting youth workers in who can talk to children, talk to them about healthy relationships, talk to them about the science. Because, of course, there are some radicalised young men, but there's a lot of, as you said, there's a lot of young men who just have sort of negative attitudes towards relationships. And the sort of thing that's probably going to be more effective there is getting youth workers in to actually tell children about relationships. And so I would really encourage and hope the government take that seriously as well. The interesting big question here is, are they going to make this part of the Terrorism Act? So there's a hint in this story that they're going to somehow change the Terrorism Act to say that if you're planning some sort of act against women, it's terrorism. That would be a really big change. It might be the right thing to do, but it means you can hold people for a lot longer without a judge agreeing you can. It would mean that you can have informants going in. It means you can tap people's phones. These are quite significant civic liberties that we've been a bit cautious about protecting. I think we've got to move a little bit carefully.
And it's not entirely clear in the reporting, though it says that on the Metro, whether it is going towards terrorism or extremism, because I think the language... And for that point is why it's so key. On the sort of the radicalisation, if we're going to use that word about young men, when it comes to misogyny, in the work that you do, and I guess the work that you do, is how much is social media and that to blame, and what's being done to try and tackle that sort of thing?
I think social media is a really massive part of the story. So the survey I mentioned earlier found that a quarter of all children, teenage children, had seen social media posts that encourage violence against women and girls. 1 in 4 in the last year, 1 in 4. Now, the real kicker is when you say... Well,
is it all networks? That's fascinating.
Yeah, all across all networks. 1 in 4 teenagers said they've seen it. Now, what's interesting is you say, well, how did you come across it? A third of the children came across it because the platform pushed it at them. Now, that is just... Like, if I was running one of these platforms, there's a bit of me that must feel like, what the heck am I doing?
But they make money
fixed.
from it because algorithmically they push people towards the most extreme points of view because they're the most attention-grabbing. The more time you spend on social media, the more of their data, your data, they can harvest and sell on to advertisers. So there is a financial incentive for them to participate in the radicalisation process. And there is a mental health element to this as well, actually. There is a pattern that misogynistic influencers follow where they're preying on young men and boys who feel anxious, who feel uncertain about the state of the world because they're looking at the world and that's a normal thing to feel. But then they tell them that the reasons that they feel that way are because of feminism and women. So I think more mental health support, absolutely, more youth workers in schools, just more funding and resources for schools is going to be really key here.
Yeah, it's a huge area, but that was a really good discussion. Let's move on to the story on the front of the Telegraph now. And, well, let's just take us through the headline there, John.
Yeah.
It's accused of weakening support from Ukraine. You know, the government has always said it is standing full square behind.
Yeah, I think Number 10 would be quite troubled by this headline. Starmer accused of weakening support for Ukraine. I think it's a massive part of the Starmer brand that actually is very strong on security. What's the story saying? So we've given Ukraine these Storm Shadow missiles, these missiles that can be launched a fair distance to attack, but we've said you can't use them to attack something in Russia. Now, that's been the position of the previous government as well. So the story of weakening support is maybe a little bit of a stretch in that it's not a change. Starmer's not rowing back. But the question is, will he allow Ukraine to use these weapons? They are being attacked by Russia, obviously, and the supply chains that get all the weapons there are coming from Russia. So you could say, well, it makes sense to attack. The US position, the UK position, has been, we don't want you to do this. We're worried you're going to accidentally provoke a nuclear response, a serious escalation of the war, and I have a lot of sympathy with that. What makes the position we presently have, though, a bit weird is at the moment, Ukraine is allowed to invade Russia. It's got about 2,000 men, potentially, in Russia now, making massive advances with British tanks, so they can fire a tank that Britain provided in Russia at Russians, but they can't fire a missile from Ukraine at Russia. That is a bit weird. And yet, all these decisions about escalation are like that. It's just why not go one more step where we've done the previous step? The other question is how much difference it would actually make, because the Russians could just move everything back so that they're further away from where the missiles will
But that is the argument,
land.
isn't it, that you want to try and push them back to get some more standoff so they can't launch these glide bombs at people. But the point about the red lines is always fascinating, isn't it? Because these red lines have always approached, then stepped over, and then it moves further forward. But I guess that the argument is, and the fear is, that if you allow long-range missiles to start striking deep into Russia, that'll be a red line that's too far for Putin.
I don't know if it's fair to say that Ukraine is allowed to invade Russia, because by all accounts, NATO, the West, knew nothing about about that incursion that happened at the beginning of last week. That was a surprise incursion. But when it comes to these long-range missiles, my understanding, and this was run in the Times a couple of days ago, is that it's actually the United States that is the main power behind blocking UK weapons being used in this way. So if the UK wants to reverse the decision of the previous government on this, it's going to have to take on the United States, which I don't think it's going to do.
And the US are denying this. So the story covers this a little bit. So and why would we have to rely on the US permission? It's because these weapons rely on US systems. So we'd actually be using some US parts to do this. The US have said, we're not blocking it, it's not us. They would say that. But these decisions generally have been made a little bit in lockstep. And I think that's a sensible position for the UK to be in. If we're going to actually do something that raises the ante, this is some serious risk we're dealing with here. I think it makes sense for us to move with our partners. I think eventually this will go the same way everything goes. Eventually we'll allow it, but we'll signal it first and then change.
And then where does that leave us all at the end of it, doesn't it?
Yep.
Right, that's the point. All right, John, Natasha, really good talk. Thanks, guys, both. More from you later on. Coming up on Sky News at 11. We'll have the latest from Ukraine, as President Zelensky says that his forces are edging deeper into Russia in an effort to create a buffer zone in the Kursk region. As many as 2,000 Ukrainian soldiers, after a surprise incursion, are now holding ground in Russia as Russia looks to try and respond.